Hello and welcome again. The next topic that I want to explore is the question of whether we are right to regard Southeast Europe as constituting a region and what it means when we talk about regions. Uh, this is a question that is important in the sense of developing categories, but also I think important from the point of view of the approach that we come from in doing this in a department like the one that we're in, which is a department of area studies. And what we can say about area studies is that at one time there was not really a lot of confusion about what people were referring to when they were talking about area studies. It used to at least seem to be perfectly clear. I mean, especially in the context of the Cold War. When we were the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, we knew what East Europe was. We knew what the reason was for studying it. The reasons were largely political and had to do with the conflict that was the dominant conflict in the world. Um, in fact, you could argue that the categories of area studies were always constructed, at least in part, probably in the largest part, by political needs related to colonialism and imperialism, later by the political conflicts of the Cold War. And they were constructed in very large part by some of the factors that we touched upon earlier, by essentialism and exoticism, by concepts that integrated an image of fundamental difference, making an area a topic of its own. Think about terms that are often applied to Southeast Europe, like the periphery of Europe, like the bridge between East and West. Think about the name of our institution, which is a very strange one if you think about it, the School for Slavonic and East European Studies. Um, Slavonic is a term that you don't hear often in conversation unless somebody is talking about Old Church Slavonic or about Franz Liszt composition, Slavonic dances. Uh, Furthermore, if it refers to a group of languages, it's not a group of language that is shared in the whole region that we've studied. We probably came off better than our sister institution, which is called the School for Oriental and African Studies. So they've integrated the Orientalism right into the name. Um, like all of categories that are designed to impose firm distinctions on a world that's characterized by diversity, the categories of area studies have always been a little bit incoherent. The most coherent part of the name of a school like SEAS, the School for Slavonic and East European Studies, at least for a time, was East European. But what does the term East European mean now? In I think at one time it referred to a political division that was dominant during the period of the Cold War. Maybe also for a period it referred to a process of transition that could continue to be used to differentiate one part of Europe from another. But we do frequently raise the question, is there a category that can be called Eastern Europe? And if we raise this question, and if we answer it in some critical ways, we raise the question of whether institutions like ours really have reason to exist. Is there an East to study? You'll find, I think, even at SEAS these days, people very often avoid using terms like Eastern Europe, and we use a vaguer term instead. We talk about the CEAS region, which refers, I suppose, broadly to anything that somebody in the institution might happen to be looking at. Well, what do we study, and is there an Eastern Europe is there a region of Southeast Europe and so on? I would argue this, that the answer to the question really depends on how we answer the question that stands behind it. That is, what we think of as constituting an area or what we think of constituting as a region. Now, traditionally, we can answer this question by looking at a map. That is, we think of regions as being bounded by some kind of shared geographic space. But there are a lot of reasons why this traditional answer is not in most contexts sufficient. And so it's also possible to think of regions as being constituted in some alternative ways. We can also think of regions as being bound by some kind of shared cultural or historical experience. This might be something broad like languages or like families of languages. It might be something broader than that like religion, or it might be something narrower than that. a category like post-socialist states or accession states, something along this lines. And another way that we can think of regions is to think of regions as being bound not by physical space and not necessarily by cultural markers, but by shared issues, by shared problems, by shared phenomena that give us reason to consider them as constituting a group. And in that sense, it might be possible to conceive of regions as areas not bounded by geographical space, but as bounded by experiential space. Now, this list that I have given you is not exhaustive, of course, but the intention of giving you the list is to open up space to allow us to be flexible about categories. So if we want to think of a region, we can think of regions as defined by phenomena, and then we can define the phenomena as some kind of central issue, right? We can say our region is states challenged by the construction or reassertion of authoritarian political structures. Or we can think of states as defined by or regions as constituting states defined by shared characteristics. Medium-sized economies, states with aging populations, states with shrinking populations, something like this, and treat those as areas. If we do this, we do raise the question of whether terms like area or region really have any meaning, or if they just become a catch-all for whatever categories that we might want to construct. That is, we again raise the question of whether area studies has a reason to exist. I want to offer a mild argument for why area studies has a reason to exist. And that's this. It's a methodological argument. What really defines the approach of area studies is that it's an approach to understanding a region that is grounded in, that is defined by familiarity with the place that is being studied. So familiarity with language, with culture, with history of a particular space of the world. That is, the depth of area studies analysis draws its authority not from its methodological or theoretical sophistication or technical virtuosity, but from a kind of engagement, from a kind of intimacy with the space. And in doing that, it provides an alternative to the kind of distancing that is imposed by the sorts of methodologies that are fashionable at the moment in academic study. The big data approach in which surveys are used to draw comparisons among 50 or 70 or 200 countries without necessarily knowing anything detailed or having any feeling for any of those. But I do think even with this defense that we remain with some questions that are posed that we need to think of ways to address somehow. And so I'm going to give you a relatively open question, which I do not want to answer myself. I want to open it up for our discussion when we have our meeting, and that is this. Where does Southeast Europe fit, or where do different parts of Southeast Europe fit? They don't all necessarily fit in the same way in this less geographically bounded concept of regions or areas. As what are the categories that we might think of as defining or constituting our region, if we agree that there is one?